Thank you, Madam Chairperson and members of the committee. I appreciate your being willing to listen today. I, too, held the office of Attorney General in this state for almost 5 years, from 1980 to 84, and I was in the Attorney General's office for 7 years before that as a homicide prosecutor. And I have personally been involved in either of those roles with over 200 homicide cases. I can tell you that when I held that responsibility, that I had no hesitation in carrying out the duty that was placed upon my shoulders to decide how to prosecute homicide cases. And we had cases that under today's law would qualify as capital cases, and under the law then qualified as capital cases, that did not end up with a death penalty. I have spent years with the responsibility of enforcing criminal law in this state. I have thought about that responsibility as I once held it, and I have taken into account what I think I have learned is our sense of the prosecution of these kinds of cases has evolved, and my understanding has evolved. I think that we should move to repeal the death penalty in New Hampshire, and I do not believe that the death penalty that we have does anything to add to public safety or protection of the citizens of New Hampshire beyond having a penalty of life without parole for these crimes. I have been to scores of homicide scenes. I have seen the victims and I've seen the victims' families. Like Phil McLaughlin, I don't see a distinction between these victims that could possibly justify the kind of procedure we try to set in motion with all best intentions to produce just and fair results, which in the end we can only conclude is in some cases incapable of doing that. We have a procedure that we must realize is incapable of fairly and justly and without arbitrary decisions imposing this ultimate penalty on the rare few who have committed homicide. When I think about what has caused me to come to this conclusion, I think about what, again, we know to be the case, that there have been dozens of people who have been convicted of capital murder in the United States with the most sophisticated, the best, in my judgment, legal system in the world. It can always be improved upon. I don't think there's a better one. Yet we know that people who are innocent have been sentenced to death and have been put to death. That penalty, unlike all others, doesn't allow us to use the error-correcting mechanism upon which we rely on all the other cases to correct our mistakes. Because an exoneration for someone who is innocent but has been put to death is completely unavailing. It is disturbing to me, as I have watched this now for more than 30 years, that it's indisputably the case that our system imposes this death penalty on people in certain racial and ethnic segments of our society disproportionately. And I suppose that that may be happening in cases where people honestly believe they're not subjected to any kind of different judgment because of the defendant belonging to such a category, but I believe they're mistaken. I believe that the system, a human system, which will err by the results that are undeniable, does not produce an even-handed and fair result, which is a requirement in every criminal case and a basic entitlement of every American citizen. And yet we're not doing it in these cases, and we shouldn't be doing it. We shouldn't be doing what we're doing. I personally find it troubling, deeply troubling, that as I look back over a time when I know there were a number of potentially capital cases, and we haven't executed anyone in this state in 75 years, approaching a century, that we have had 2 capital cases brought in the recent past. The one defendant who was a white man got life without parole, and the defendant who was a black man got death. I find that deeply troubling when we know that that is the kind of thing that's been happening for a long time in our country. I can tell you that of the many, many homicide cases that I have seen personally, there were several that involved killing police officers, there were several that involved killing for hire, and those defendants did not get the death penalty. One way to think about how unusual this is to recognize, according to FBI statistics, that there are approximately 15,000 homicides every year in the United States, and only about 100 people are selected for prosecution for capital punishment. And a tiny percentage of those end up on death row, and an even smaller percentage end up being put to death. It is truly an understatement to say that we impose the death penalty arbitrarily and therefore unfairly. I'd ask you to consider some other points that seem to me to be worthy of consideration. The death penalty is the only one that's imposed by a jury instead of a judge. And our criminal justice system, judges, after juries decide guilt or innocence, impose the penalty. And we have, in our state and federal system, adopted mechanisms we felt were necessary to try to guard against disproportionate sentences. So in New Hampshire, we have a sentence review division in the Superior Court, and the sentences can be reviewed by 3 other judges to see if it fits what happens to other people who are similarly situated. But a jury, by definition in these cases, will never have sentenced anyone before. They have absolutely no experience in deciding how to do this, and what they do will not be reviewable on even the basis we apply to every burglary case, every other criminal case. It's only reviewed by the courts to see whether there were aggravating circumstances present, but not whether equal justice under law was provided in this case. How could we do that when we are approaching a point in time when we will have 1 execution in nearly a century? There is no way to say that there is some proper comparison group and to judge that what has been done is equal, is fair, and just. Instead, it seems to be inescapable that the penalty is imposed arbitrarily and selectively. I'd like to suggest another reason we might think that the death penalty will be imposed disparately and inconsistently. And I assume, as Phil McLaughlin did, by the way, that virtually all the people who participate in our criminal justice system do so with honesty and a commitment to fairness. I have been in countless grand juries in this state, and I've taken it as one of the privileges I've had to be in front of 23 of my fellow citizens where a prosecutor appears with no one else there from the government, and you present the criminal case to them, and they impress you with how diligent and how seriously they approach the task, how diligent they are, and how seriously they want to do the right thing. And I believe that that's a very good indication of who serves in our criminal justice system, in juries or elsewhere. But we know that we are sharply divided about this. We know that people who go on to juries, just like the study committee here in New Hampshire, will have strongly held different views. And so some defendants may draw a jury that thinks that the death penalty is appropriate. They may find it more easy to impose that penalty. And another defendant who is precisely equally culpable may draw a different jury where at least one person thinks the death penalty is unwise. And because a unanimous verdict is required, that defendant won't get the death penalty. crimes are the same, the outcomes are stunningly different. I want to, if you'll permit me, I'd like to read you a quote that came to mind, and I'd like to make this comment from a personal standpoint. I have spent innumerable hours, at all hours of the day and night, in police stations all across this state over nearly 12 years. I have worked with policemen. I understand law enforcement, I think, from that perspective. I understand how hardworking and honest and diligent they are. And I have a member of my family who is currently a policeman, is twice a combat veteran in Iraq. And I have another member of my family who was in the French resistance in World War II, who fought the Nazis, who was arrested and put in prison with the death penalty. And that's what made me think of this quote, because the death penalty there, under the fascists, had a twist. You were imprisoned, but you didn't know what day they were going to kill you. So every day that you heard the footsteps come down the corridor, you had to wonder whether that was what was going to happen that day. The writer Albert Camus has a quote I'd like to read to you, because we know that in this country, despite good intentions, we have people sitting on death row for over a decade and not knowing when or whether we will carry out that sanction. What he said is, but what then is capital punishment but the most premeditated of murders, to which no criminal's deed, however calculated it may be, can be compared? For there to be equivalence, the death penalty would have to punish a criminal who had warned his victim of the date at which he would inflict the horrible death on him, and who from that moment onward had confined him at his mercy for months. Such a monster is not encountered in our private life. I want to say that we all know deeply within us that we stand squarely in a tradition of Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman values of human life. I don't approach this from a moral standpoint or a religious standpoint, but it is at our core political ideals that we respect human rights and human dignity, and we have been described by some as the last best hope of humanity. We see an advancing, maturing tendency in civilization, yet all the Western democracies have moved away from this punishment. We stand alone in retaining it. We stand with Iran, Saudi Arabia, China, and North Korea, in company with which we should not stand. The death penalty does not provide deterrence. The evidence is clear on that point. It doesn't meet any of the other objectives of criminal punishment that isn't met by life without parole. I realize that this judgment rests in your hands, but it seems to me that the time has come for New Hampshire to join an increasing number of states to move away from the death penalty. And I urge you, as I know many victims of these crimes would, to abolish the death penalty. I would be glad to try to answer your questions now or at any time while this matter is under your consideration. Thank you.
Representative Fields.
Thank you. Just so that I understand clearly what you said earlier, you mentioned something about the jury is the only one that can provide the death penalty. If we repeal this, is there another section about the jury that would change this, or would this delete the jury's decision?
I didn't look closely at the bill, but I'm quite sure what you intend to do is to remove that option as a sanction for homicide, make the maximum penalty life without parole. I was just pointing out that it's the only crime where we turn the sentencing decision over to the jury, and there are reasons why we do that. But the problem is that juries are, each one of them, never going to have had any experience in doing that before.
Thank you. I just want to make sure I understood what you said. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.